let's get started from the top. So I've done a couple of meetings in the past, where I've outlined the basic fight for trans liberation, or I've discussed the history of the LGBT plus liberation movements, or even the history of things like, the concept of the nuclear family or of family units. But today I want to take a much more in-depth look at what sex and gender actually are. And the reason for this is because the recent Supreme Court ruling has made a big deal of what we commonly refer to as biological sex. Now, upon hearing this ruling, my first thought was, well, how exactly are they going to define biological sex? I mean, it's not actually a simple question. Now, this question is going to be central to the meeting I'm about to do. And while I will say I've done a lot of research for this meeting, I have not had time to obtain a biology degree. So just, letting you all know. But I will try my best for you all. But before we do that, I just want to take a quick look at the events of the past week, because it was 1 week ago today that Judge Lord Hodge concluded that the meaning of the terms sex, man, and women in the Equalities Act 2010 refer to biological sex, claiming that any other interpretation would make the act, quote, incoherent and impracticable. And the judge said that a person with a gender recognition certificate in the female gender does not come within the definition of a woman under the Equalities Act 2010. Now, a gender recognition certificate is something, it's a document which allows some trans people to supposedly legally live as the gender they identify as. The recent Supreme Court ruling has led to lots of people doubting what the point of a gender recognition certificate even is, but, that's a different matter. What the document means is that you can change your gender marker on things, such as passports and birth certificates or marriage certificates and things like this. And, if you're a trans woman, you can make it so your passport says female. If you're a trans man, you can make it so your passport says male. I am non-binary, so I don't get a gender recognition certificate because, as far as the British state are concerned, we officially do not exist as non-binary people. Something which the Supreme Court also reaffirmed within their ruling. So there are 9 protected characteristics under the Equalities Act, including sex and gender reassignment, which are considered separate characteristics. Now, trans plus people will still have some rights under the gender reassignment characteristic, but the ruling legitimizes those who want to deny trans rights altogether and removing trans people from public life completely. And we only need to look at the reaction to the ruling from the usual suspects, as much as I loathe to mention her name, people such as J.K. Rowling, who have been ecstatic and gleeful over the possibility of further denying rights to trans plus people. And indeed, the Labour Party is in an utter shambles over this ruling. I mean, they don't quite know what to say, do they? Instead, they decide to talk in circles. Yesterday, at 9:55 a.m., Bridget Phillipson gave an interview in which she said that the Supreme Court ruling means that trans women should use male toilets. Now, barely half an hour later, in a different interview, which she gave at 10:28, she said that it was, The Guardian called it a more nuanced answer. She said that it was up to pubs to decide their own toilet policy. Now, this slight change of tune half an hour later did not stop the Prime Minister's spokesperson at the Downing Street briefing yesterday from being very matter-of-fact on the issue. He said this, he said, when asked the same question as Phillipson, he said they would use a bathroom consistent with their biological sex, as per the rule. That's what the Education Secretary said this morning, and that's what the court judgment makes clear, that all trans people should follow their biological sex when deciding what services they use. And if this wasn't bad enough from this guy, he went further. When asked, does the PM still believe that trans women are women, he replied, no. When asked if the PM would continue to respect the pronouns of trans women, something which the Supreme Court said nothing about for the record, he replied saying he was not going to discuss hypotheticals. So you would think it was a simple answer. Yes, of course you will. But no, he was not going to discuss hypotheticals. And all of this came before the piece de resistance, as it were, when just after 5 p.m. yesterday, Phillipson addressed Parliament. And we got more of the same. Now, for the sake of time, because we have a lot to get through in this meeting, I'm not going to go through everything she said in Parliament. It was more of the same. But it does signal a number of fights we have ahead, particularly within the NHS. She made a big deal of referencing the NHS throughout her speech and tying the Supreme Court rulings in with Labour's promises to do things such as abolish mixed-sex wards and other auspicious comments which have nothing to do with trans people, and yet they are tying them into trans people, and we all know why. And at the heart of this is this insidious push from those who call themselves gender-critical feminists, who have adopted a very specific and rigid and, to be frank, outdated understanding of biology. So that leads us to the question, which is central to our meeting: how do we define sex? Well, how do we define sex? If you ask your average transphobe, you'll probably get a mumbled answer about how you can't change biology. Perhaps uteruses will be mentioned, or some other organ which only real women are deemed to have. And if you push them for long enough, you will end up with what most of these people really think. It's chromosomes, XX, XY, they will cry. Now, at this point, I want us all to play a game, right? We're going to play the transphobes' favorite game. Let's pretend we're scientists, right? So, step number one. How do we, as scientists, very real scientists, how do we define biological sex? Well, there are a number of ways in which we can do this, right? But there are three central definitions which are often used by scientists. The first one, as we have mentioned, is chromosomal sex, also known as genetic sex. And chromosomal sex is the chromosomes that a person has. It's generally XX for females and XY for males. Now, this is something that we will all be familiar with because this is something which is taught in any GCSE biology lesson. Now, considering that most people stop studying biology after they finish their GCSEs, it should come as no surprise to us all that the idea of chromosomal sex become in many ways a common sense understanding of biological sex in broader society. And it should be said at this point that actually it's a very basic view of biology. People will often scream, it's basic biology. Correct, it's basic biology. It is not advanced biology. An example of advanced biology would be something like acknowledging that actually there are much broader chromosomal arrangements than just XX and XY, which we can discuss more later. So chromosomal sex is not the only way in which we can define sex or understand sex. There are many other ways, And at this point, I want to talk about a gamete-based definition of sex. Now, using this definition, what we do is we look at the kind of reproductive cells that a person produces, and we use that to determine what their sex is. So you have people who produce sperm, and you have those who produce eggs, right? That's it, right? No. Absolutely not. Actually, there are also people who can produce both sperm and eggs, and there are people who can produce none. Now, following the gamete-based approach to biological sex, we don't actually end up with, a binary two. You instead end up with four distinct biological sexes. You can't say otherwise. These people are biologically distinct from one another, and the latter two categories are often referred to as being an intersex condition. And we'll discuss a bit more of that later. But for now, I want to move on to the final way in which we can define sex, and that is morphological sex. Now, in this context, it refers to the physical and the physiological differences between people, primarily focusing on reproductive organs and structures, but also on secondary sex characteristics such as facial hair or breast growth. And when sex is looked at morphologically, we begin to see biological sex as much less as something binary, but instead of something that we refer to as being bimodal. Now, the traditional binary model of sex categorizes individuals as either being male or female based on a few key biological factors, so-called key biological factors like chromosomes or hormones and reproductive organs. But the bimodal model acknowledges the variation within these factors and suggests that actually most individuals tend to cluster around one end of the spectrum or the other, male or female, but that it's a cluster and not a hard, rigid binary. And conceiving of sex in this way is significantly less rigid than the way your average transphobe conceives of sex, and thinks of biological sex. And when we look at things such as, variation in breast size or penis size or, the presence of breast tissue in many cis men, for example, in the UK, around 400 cis men a year are diagnosed with breast cancer because they have breast tissue. They're still cis men, but they have breast tissue because sex is bimodal in many ways. Hair distribution varies greatly from person to person. Some women grow facial hair, and there are many more examples I could give of this varied distribution of characteristics, which would support the idea that sex is something bimodal and not binary and immutable with fixed characteristics at all. And indeed, biology is something that can change over time, due to material factors, such as poverty. People's height, for example, is overwhelmingly affected by poverty. The more malnourished a person is, the less access they have to resources, the more likely it is that they or their children will experience biological changes as a result. And some of these changes, some of these biological differences, such as height, are intrinsically linked to our conception of gender and of gender differences within society. We transphobes love to bring up the height of trans women, don't they? It's something they're obsessed with. It was mentioned in the Cass Review, the height of people. Now, Alex Kalinikos, who is a leading member of our organization, he wrote a brilliant article which was published yesterday in our newspaper, Socialist Worker, which we have copies of at the back. Now, he said this, he said, the intellectual core of Marxism is historical materialism. You know, it doesn't in the slightest ignore our variable biological constitution, but integrates this into a broader historical process through which human beings form and are formed by their societies, you know. And this is a totally different perspective to what a lot of the transphobes come up with, which is something we would often refer to as being biological essentialism, which I'll talk more about later, you know. And all of this comes without even addressing the question, can you change your sex? Well, given the definitions of sex that I have just given above, while the transphobes are right about one thing, you can't change your chromosomes, they're wrong about pretty much everything else, aren't they? I mean, you can change your secondary sex characteristics, you can have things removed or added, you can have hormone replacement therapy, which will change your patterns of hair growth, redistribute fat in your body, you know, you will grow breasts or even begin to grow a penis, depending on the kind of hormones you're taking. And in other words, you most certainly can change elements of your biological sex. I mean, what is this if not changing your biological sex? Please, someone tell me, you know. And intrinsically connected to the idea of how we define biological sex is the idea of a species. How do we define a species? Which brings me on to my next question. How do we define a species? You know, and there are countless approaches to how we define a species. Species is, after all, a very human concept. And your average transphobe is often referred to with a certain phrase, which I just mentioned, you know, biological essentialist. Now, biological essentialism is also known as a species essentialism or the essentialist species concept. And it's the view that every species in existence exists as something distinct, fixed, unchanging, and rigid. It posits that there are two binary ideals within the human species, that of male and female, and that anything which falls outside of these two categories is simply a deviation or a mutation. You know, like intersex people who we referred to earlier, these people in the essentialist model would be seen as just being deviations and mutations from the norm, not as distinct genders, you know, or sexes rather. But you know, and they will just claim that, you know, it's a mutation from the norm within human society, you know, and the idea of a normal within human society is, you know, it's a very pervasive idea, you know, something which must be upheld, and it's backed up by the ideas such as biological essentialism. Within human society, the idea of a normal which must be upheld is extremely pervasive, and it's backed up by the ideas such as biological essentialism, which, you know, does not allow for any kind of biological diversity within humanity. Instead, from birth, people are interfered with, surgically operated on, in order to bring them into line with this predetermined idea of normal. You know, babies will have their genitals meddled with in order to make them look more like one of the two so-called binary sexes. And biological essentialism is also pervasive because it seeks to explain certain aspects of oppression that we face. You know, for example, you know, from within this rigid framework. For example, when faced with the issue of sexual harassment or sexual abuse, biological essentialists look not to society, not to the kind of environment that young boys are brought up in as an explanation, and more importantly, as a way to undermine sexist ideas in society. Instead, essentialists claim that sexual abuse and sexual violence is the result of biology directly. You know, instead, essentialists will say that, you know, biology is immutable, unchangeable, and if sexual abuse is a result of biology, that means you can't do anything about it, which isn't a very hopeful position, I don't think. They claim the mere existence of penises and testosterone is the cause of sexual violence, and they believe those with a certain kind of biology are more likely to commit certain acts, you know, directly because of their biology and not because of other factors in society. And the bottom line here becomes that there is nothing you can do to stop sexual violence, as it's simply built into the biology of a mass of people. And even if you have trans women, well, as far as a gender critical or, you know, a transphobe is concerned, these people have this biology, they're destined to commit sexual violence, there's nothing you can do about it. That's what these people think, because they are essentialists. And it leads them into this vicious transphobic position where they try to systematically exclude trans people, and trans women in particular, from public life. And while this ruling affects all trans people, I do feel the need to say that this is an undoubtedly particularly nasty attack, which is over-focused on trans women and trans feminine people in particular, directly as a result of this biological essentialist view of people and the crimes that some people commit. Now, in opposition to the essentialist species model, which again is seen as by most scientists as being laughably outdated and just plain wrong, we instead have a much more up-to-date biological species concept. Now, the biological species concept while not perfect, I mean, we're still working and developing a lot of these things out, but after decades of bigots systematically preventing such research from being done, but the biological species model is a much better model than the essentialist concept. The biological species concept defines a species as members of populations that actually or potentially, that's an important word, potentially interbreed in nature, not according to similarity of appearance, because although appearance is helpful in identifying a species, it does not define a species. So instead we look at the theoretical possibility of reproduction. Now, despite what many people have been led to believe, the vast majority of intersex people can actually reproduce, either naturally or with technological assistance. So as you can all quite clearly see, there is most certainly a theoretical, and in fact a much more than theoretical possibility of reproduction. And therefore, there is no justifiable reason scientifically to refer to these people as mutations or deviations. 1 in 100 people are considered to be intersex in some way. And under the essentialist concept, these people are said to be nothing more than these mutations, these deviations. People are not deviations. People are not mutations. They are people, they're deserving of respect and dignity and an identity of their own. And these people, are arguably their own distinct biological sex, which exists outside of the binary male and female categories. Now, I mentioned that 1 in 100 people are intersex. I stutter. Do you know how many people stutter? I'll tell you, 1 in 100. What about autistic people? Do you know how many people are autistic? 1 in 100. People with celiac disease, can you guess? 1 in 100. People who are OCD, say it with me now, 1 in 100. Are these people mutations? Are they deviations? Of course they're not. It's such an absurd thing to say. And yet the transphobes think that they can continue to put people into boxes. They think they can hold back scientific progress, using the Supreme Court. These people are enemies of human progress, and it's vital we fight back. Now, in my last 3 minutes, I want to talk a bit about how we can fight back, because yesterday, myself and around 350 other activists from various community groups and trade unions and organizations, we gathered online for an organizing meeting of the newly created We Demand Change Coalition. A coalition of people who want to bring change to the Labour government and things like that. And during the discussion, one person posted the following message in the chat when the conversation turned to how do we get the trans community involved. And this is what this person said. They said, frankly, good luck with the trans community. My quiet discussions away from the demonstrations tells me that the trans women are planning to flee en masse at the moment. Now, I don't think this is entirely true. I don't think every trans person is thinking of leaving the UK. However, I do know that some people do want to flee. I have met people who want to flee because of the rising transphobia in the UK. And these people and this commenter, they reminded me a lot of some words that were said, that were written by the Russian-Ukrainian revolutionary Leon Trotsky. He wrote an article called For a Workers' United Front Against Fascism. And in this article, Trotsky said, worker communists, you are hundreds of thousands, millions. You cannot leave for any place. There are not enough passports for you. Should fascism come to power, it will ride over your skulls and spines like a terrific tank. Your salvation lies in merciless struggle. And I think it's a very important thing to remember when we think about fleeing or going somewhere else, because actually we're seeing a global push from the far right to attack trans people. So the question is, where do we go? There's nowhere to go. There are not enough passports for all of us, as Trotsky said. And Trotsky's words were true in regard to fighting fascism, but they were also true in regard to fighting for trans rights. And what we need is the unity of working class people in the struggle for trans liberation. Another example I can give from yesterday's We Demand Change meeting was when a speaker for the Birmingham bin strikers, I'm sure people have heard about that, Stephen, in the middle of detailing the strike and the government's attempts to break it, he stopped to take time to talk about trans rights and the attacks on disabled people. He joined the dots between the strikers in Birmingham and the fight against the Supreme Court and the fight against the government's austerity measures attacking disabled people. He joined those dots and connected the struggles, and actually those discussions are products of the picket lines, they're products of workers' struggle. And that's why, as a Marxist organization, we put the trade unions, workplaces, as a central element in how we fight back. And, And this is very important, I think, that he said something like this, because the government is panicking over the Birmingham bin strikes. And instead of capitulating to bad deals, the striking workers have kicked the government in the teeth. And then they've said, oh, and by the way, we're going to stand for trans rights as well. And that right there is how you build a mass movement against the British state. Now, notice that how I am using the word state here. There is a difference between the state and the government. You know, we elect the government, but we don't elect the state. The judge who presided over this ruling, we didn't elect him. None of the judges are elected. None of the generals in the army are elected. None of the civil servants are elected. None of the heads of corporations, the CEOs and the financiers and the bankers, none of these people are elected, and these people form the British state. So we're not just fighting against Starmer and the Labour Party, we're also fighting against these elements of the British state, the judiciary and other things that are seeking to limit us and take away our rights. Now, I spoke at a meeting a couple of weeks ago on the topic of the disability cuts, and during the discussion, someone said, you know, this isn't the first time we've done something like this. We took down the poll tax. We took down Thatcher. We smashed the National Front. We smashed the BNP. We've brought down many bad bills in the past. Many bad governments have come down in the past. And the best example I can give is that of Section 28, something brought in by Margaret Thatcher, which made it illegal to mention homosexuality in schools. Now, some of our comrades in the teaching union ensured that Section 28 was unworkable. You know, they refused en masse to implement it. And there was nothing the government can do because the movement behind them was just so strong. And when I speak to some of my comrades who were there at the time, who were teachers, they tell me not a single teacher got sacked for refusing to implement Section 28. They couldn't do it. The government didn't have the confidence to sack a single teacher. They made it unworkable. And we can make this ruling unworkable as well. Over the weekend, there was 30,000 people on the streets of London. And outside of London, you know, Sheffield, Bristol, Dundee, Manchester, Swansea, Hastings, and many, many more. This Sunday in Newcastle, 1 p.m. at the Monument, we've got our own demonstration. You know, it was true what Trotsky said. We are hundreds of thousands. We are millions. And we've done this before. We've taken the British state on before, and we've won before, and we can win again. So I'll finish here. I always finish my meetings on transliberation with this particular quote. It's a quote that comes from the founder of our organisation, a man called Tony Cliff, who founded the what would become the Socialist Workers' Party in 1951. Now, in 1978, Cliff wrote these words: "We are all the children of capitalism, so we tend to conceive of the future, even the socialist future, in an ordered and hierarchical way. It is thought as though the socialist revolution will be led by the father of the chapel in the print union, the NGA working on Fleet Street. Second in command will be an AUEW convener, section 1 from the tool room in a big car factory, and the lieutenants of the revolution will all be 40-year-old male white shop stewards. If there is enough space, then we'll allow blacks and women and gays to take part, providing they stand quietly at the back. A lot of socialists still have difficulty believing that gays will be taking part in the revolution at all. On the contrary," Cliff says, "we should look forward now to the first leader of the London Workers' Council being a 19-year-old black gay woman." Now, there is one correction that I will make here, just one little correction to Cliff's words, to update them for the modern day. On the contrary, we should look forward now to the first leader of the London Workers' Council being a 19-year-old black gay trans woman. Thank you, everyone.